रेडियो खांची 90.4 एफएम पर प्रसारित किए जाने वाले विषय वस्तु का सारा क्रेडिट प्रस्तुतकर्ता को दिया जाता है। हमारा मकसद है समाज में ज्ञान एवं सकारात्मकता को आगे बढ़ाना।
रेडियो खांची 90.4 FM हम सब का रेडियो। The topic for today is metaphysical poetry. Myself, Dr. Om Prakash, guest faculty English BA Department, Ronda College, Ranchi. This topic is useful for English honors student of Ranchi University, Ranchi. The characteristics of metaphysical poetry. What is metaphysical poetry? And what are the role of John Donne and Ben Jonson for metaphysical poetry? In fact, English literature divided into prose, poetry and drama. Poetry is one of the simplest way to express our feelings and emotions. According to William Wordsworth, the spontaneous overflow of our feelings and emotions is called poetry. In the beginning of the 17th century, there were two poets who revolted against the Elizabethan convention of writing poetry. They were John Donne and Ben Jonson. In the age of Spenser, Sidney and even Shakespeare, his music for all classes was an important part of daily life. The whole age was called Nest of Singing Birds. Both Ben Jonson and John Donne made a complete dissociation from the sing-song pattern of poetry writing. One became the father of Cavalier School of Poetry and other inaugurated the metaphysical school of poetry. Generally, meta means beyond and physics means physical nature. It was John Dryden who first used the word metaphysical in connection with Donne's poetry and poetry. And he wrote, Donne affects the metaphysics not only in his satires but also in his amorous verses and perplexes the minds of the people. So etymologically we can say that metaphysical poetry is that part of poetry that is meta means beyond and physics means physical nature. So beyond the idea, the poetry based upon beyond the idea is called metaphysical poetry. According to Dr. Samuel Johnson, the metaphysical poets were men of learning and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. Johnson further says that if the father of criticism, Aristotle, has rightly denominated poetry an imitative art, they neither copied nature nor life, neither painted the forms of matter nor represent the operations of intellect. In a broad sense, the term metaphysical poetry is used to connote philosophical poetry or poetry dealing with metaphysics, exploring the problems of one and the many, unity and division, and the spirit and flesh. Sir Herbert Grierson defines the term metaphysical poetry is a poetry which has been inspired by a philosophical conception of the universe and the role assigned to the human spirit in the great drama of existence. The very term metaphysical hints more at the style or a particular way of writing poetry, which was something new. The metaphysical poetry is heavily overloaded with conceits, which may be defined as the excessive use of over-elaborated similes and metaphors drawn from the most far-fetched, remote and unfamiliar sources. Poets have always perceived similarity between the dissimilar objects and use similes and metaphors to convey their perception of that similarity. The peculiarity of the metaphysical lies in the fact that they are figures of speech, the use of figures of speech excessively. Their similes and metaphors are far-fetched and are often drawn from the most unfamiliar sources. Their similes are elaborated to the farthest limit. Their images are logical and intellectual rather than senses. Besides, the metaphysical poetry is complex and difficult. It is intellectual in tone. There is a fusion of emotional and intellectual. The fusion of emotional and intellectual things called an unification of sensibility. It is argumentative and full of conceits. Originality is achieved by the use of new vocabulary drawn from the world of trade and commerce, the arts and sciences. The metaphysical poetry is often dramatic in form. Even in the 19th century, metaphysical poetry were not recognized as great poets to Wordsworth. Poetry was just a pouring of emotions. According to Matthew Arnold, a poet should deal with a beautiful world and with high seriousness. In the view of S.T. Coleridge, poetry is leisure and self-possession, filled with grandeur of its subject. It was only in the 20th century that a proper recognition was given to the school of metaphysical poets. Grierson was the first critic who published an anthology with a brilliant introduction in which he wrote, "Metaphysical poetry has been inspired by a philosophical conception of the universe and the role assigned to the human spirit in the great drama of existence." The poem appears simply witty and full of riddles to those who read them without having a knowledge of St. Thomas, Copernicus, Galileo, and Bacon. There is a kind of force behind Donne's poem. His language is masculine. We find far-fetched comparisons in his poems. These are called conceit. That is why the greatest poet critic of our age, T.S. Eliot, presents John Donne in this manner. Donne, I suppose, was such another who found no substitute for sense, to seize and clutch and penetrate expert beyond experience. So that is enough about metaphysical, the general meaning of metaphysical poetry. Literally, concept of metaphysical poetry. Metaphysical poetry is unification of emotion and intellectual, that is the unification of sensibility. It is full of conceits, riddles, and from the world of trade and commerce. So it is sufficient for metaphysical poetry. I think you all have believed in the quotation, "Paresham upkarartham yo jivati sahajivita," means he who has life for others' sake has life. जो दूसरों के लिए जीता है वही जीवित है. Thank you very much.